Between the 20th of November 1945 to the 1st of October 1946, the most notable criminal trial in the history of mankind began. 22 of the highest ranking and most important surviving figures from the Nazi regime were put on trial for their crimes committed during the Third Reich's reign. 12 of the defendants would be sentenced to death, 7 would be sentenced to various lengths of stay at Spandau prison, and 3 were acquitted. This is the story of the first Nuremberg Trial. In the beginning of 1942, representatives of 9 governments who were in exile from German-occupied European countries had demanded that the Allies, when victorious, bring up an international court that should be set up to try Germany and its leaders for the crimes that they committed in Europe. Originally, the USA and UK refused to commit to a trial, citing the failures of the war crimes trials at the end of World War I. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was in favour of just shooting the surviving leaders of the Third Reich. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, wanted a show trial with a predetermined outcome for the sole purpose of propaganda and to build a strong case for war reparations. However, when victory was a higher possibility than before, it was the USA who would want a trial to document the charges against the ex-leaders of Nazi Germany, and to avoid the accusation that there was no evidence to execute the ex-leaders by those that were still sympathetic to the Nazi cause. In the eyes of the USA, this would also help show the German people the atrocities that their dear leaders committed during its reign, and to help reform the war-torn country. During late 1944 and early 1945, the United States Department of War had been drawing up plans for an international tribunal to persecute the Nazi leadership. During this time, the British government was still hell-bent on shooting the ex-Nazi leaders without a trial, but then the President of the USA, FDR, was convinced that the summary execution of Nazi leaders without a trial would result in unwarranted acts of vengeance against Allied personnel. After the death of FDR on the 12th of April 1945, the new President of the USA, Harry Truman, appointed the Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, as the US Chief of Counsel for the trial. Robert Jackson was a lawyer, politician, and jurist who was the Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court from 1941 until his passing of a heart attack in 1954. The formation of the International Military Tribunal would be announced during the San Francisco Conference on the 2nd of May 1945. During a conference between the Allied leaders in London from the 26th of June to the 2nd of August 1945, negotiations took place to finalise and decide on the form of a trial, though at this time it still was not 100% that any trial would take place at all. It was at this conference that the charges would be laid out. The charges that they decided on were crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The leaders, and by the US Chief of Counsel Robert Jackson, were debating about adding an additional charge of war of aggression, which would eventually be added to the list. During the trial, the individuals rather than the state would be prosecuted, so that the individuals themselves would be held accountable, instead of giving those that committed the crimes the easy excuse of, "I was just following orders." At the same time as the victorious leaders were deciding on the particulars of the trial, there was the debate on where the trial was to be held. The Soviets originally wanted the trial to be held in the ruined city of Berlin. However, Berlin was damaged beyond recognition during the war. Over a third of the city was pulverized and 20 blocks in all directions were obliterated in the city centre. Approximately 80% of the city centre was destroyed. Berlin was lucky, however, that a majority of the city was made out of brick and stone, and thus a large portion of the city outside of the city centre was still habitable. But the infrastructure necessary for a large trial was just no longer there. Due to agreements within the Allied powers, the trial would be held in the newly acquired USA occupied zone. The city of Nuremberg was picked because the infrastructure necessary for the trial was still somewhat intact, even though about 90% of the city was either destroyed or severely damaged. Nuremberg was also a major symbol for Nazi ideology, due to the city being where the large and vast Nuremberg rallies were held, as well as the namesake for the Nuremberg race laws. The trial would be held in the city's Palace of Justice. The Palace of Justice is a large complex that at the time included 20 courtrooms and an adjoining prison that could hold up to 1,200 inmates. Courtroom 600 was picked to hold the trials, and renovations began quickly to prepare for the upcoming trials. The courtroom was doubled in size, and an additional viewing gallery was added so that reporters and others could view the proceedings in court. Reporters, witnesses, and other people of importance to the trial would primarily stay in the Grand Hotel, which also needed quick repairs done to the historic building prior to the trial. In the courtroom, IBM would install a new instantaneous translation system for the trial. This would enable those who spoke English, German, French, and Russian to hear through headphones a real-time translation of those languages into their native tongue, so that all could understand what was being said during the trial. Because of the ability to translate the trial into multiple languages in real time, the trial ran 4 times faster than it otherwise would have. The adjoining prison at the Palace of Justice would become the home of the defendants for the next 14 months. The cell doors were bolted from the outside. The cell doors to the prisoners were not to be locked, and no keys were used, so they could have quick access to the prisoners. All the prisoners had to be watched 24/7 in case of self-deletion or escape attempts. The prisoners even were watched like a hawk when they were using the restroom. Every conversation between the guards and prisoners was to remain brief. When a prisoner would go to sleep, their hands had to be kept above the blankets, and they had to sleep with the lights still turned on. Security and surveillance was beefed up once one prisoner, Robert Lay, managed to self-delete himself. Prior to any trial, the chief prosecutors and judges still needed to be picked. There will be 4 chief prosecutors during the trial. They were Robert H. Jackson of the USA, Sir Hartley Shortcross of the United Kingdom, Francois de Menthon of France, though he would later be replaced by Auguste Chimpeter de Ribes, and Roman Rudenko of the USSR. The primary judge for the USA was Francis Biddle, who was the Attorney General during the FDR presidency. Sir Geoffrey Lawrence was the main judge for the United Kingdom, and France had 2 judges, Henri Donadieu de Varber and Robert Falco, and the USSR had appointed Iona Nikitchenko. With the stage set on the 6th of October 1945, the International Military Tribunal would place indictments on the 24 highest ranking senior Nazis who were going to be tried at the first trial. The indictments were participation in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishment of a crime against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression and other crimes against peace, participating in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The defendants that were to be tried were Martin Bormann, who was the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, private secretary to Adolf Hitler. Martin Bormann, however, would be tried in abstinence as he was never found prior to the trial. Karl Donitz, who was a German admiral who after Adolf Hitler's suicide would succeed him as the head of state of Nazi Germany until the country's surrender. Hans Frank, who was a Reich law leader from 1933 to 45 and the Governor General of the General Government in occupied Poland. Wilhelm Frick was Hitler's Minister of Interior from 1933 to 43 and the Reich Protector of Bohemia and Morava from 1943 to 45. He also co-authored the Nuremberg race laws. Hans Fritzsche was a radio commentator and head of the news division of the Nazi propaganda ministry. Walther Funk was Hitler's Minister of Economics and succeeded Dr. Hjalmar Schacht as head of the Reichsbank. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal, commander of the Luftwaffe in charge of the 4-year plan from 1936 to 45, and the original head of the Gestapo before it was turned over to the SS in April 1934. He was known for his flamboyant, in-your-face uniforms that were decorated with medals that he had won and medals he had made a purpose of winning for. He was also a morphine addict since the failed Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. Originally, he was the second highest ranking member of the Nazi Party and was Hitler's designated successor up until Hitler fell out of favour with him in April 1945. Rudolf Hess, who was a significant pushover and was Hitler's deputy Führer until he decided to fly to Scotland in 1941 to attempt to broker peace with the United Kingdom. Since his flight to the UK, he had been imprisoned. Near the end of his standing within the Nazi party, he had become a blatant nutter and a major hypochondriac. Alfred Jodl was a Reichsmark General Oberst, Wilhelm Keitel's subordinate and chief of the OKW's Operation Division from 1938 to 45. He signed the orders for the execution of Allied commandos and Soviet commissars and signed the instruments of surrender on the 7th of May 1945 as the representative of Karl Donitz. Ernest Kattelbrunner, the highest ranking member of the SS to be tried at the Nuremberg Trials. He was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office from 1943 to 45, chief of the SD, Gestapo and Kripo, as well as having overall command of the Einsatzgruppen. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW and was the de facto defense minister from 1938 to 1945. He had a dog and master type of loyalty to Hitler. He would sign numerous orders calling for soldiers and political prisoners to be executed during the Third Reich's reign of terror. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, a German diplomat and industrialist. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, would self-delete himself on the 25th of October 1945 and thus escape the trial. Konstantin von Neudrath, Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1932 to 38, Right Protector of Bohemia and Moravia from 1939 to 43. He was suspended since 1941. He would resign in 1943 because of a dispute he had with Hitler. Franz von Papen, Chancellor of Germany in 1932 and was the Vice-Chancellor below Hitler in 1933 to 34. Franz was the ambassador to Austria in 1934 to 38 and was the ambassador to Turkey in 1939 to 44. During the trial, Franz was not charged as a war criminal. Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine from 1928 until 1943. Joachim von Ribbentrop was an ambassador plenipotentiary from 1935 to 36. He was also a diplomat ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1936 to 38 and a Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1938 to 45. Alfred Rosenberg, racial theory ideologist and theorist. He would later be the Minister of Eastern Occupied Territories from 1941 to 45. Fritz Sackel, he was the Gauleiter of Thuringia from 1927 to 45 and was the plenipotentiary of the Nazi slave labour program from 1942 to 45. Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, co-founder of the German Democratic Party, was the pre-war president of the Reichsbank from 1923 to 1930 and from 1933 to 1938, and was the economics minister from 1934 to 37. Baldur von Scherer, leader of the Hitler Youth from 1933 to 1940. He was the official of Vienna from 1940 to 45. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, he played an important role in the Anschluss and was the Austrian Chancellor in 1938. He was a deputy to Hans Frank in Poland from 1939 to 1940. He would later be the Reichskommissar of the occupied Netherlands in 1940 to 1945. Albert Speer was perhaps Hitler's closest friend, Hitler's favourite architect, and was the Minister of Armaments from 1942 until the end of the war. Julius Sebastian Streicher, he was the publisher of the racist and anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. On the 20th of November 1945, the trial would begin. Reporters and onlookers looked in disgust and in awe at the 22 men on trial for their crimes who walked past into their seats by armed guards and sat in the courtroom in order that their names appeared on the indictment. These now miserable men were stripped of all insignia that once showed their ranks and also their achievements. Hermann Göring looked particularly worse for wear. No longer was he a plump man in poor physical condition. Prior to the end of the war, he was a relatively fat man, as well as a morphine addict since his injury during the beer hole push in 1923. Once he was imprisoned, he was put on a strict diet to reduce his weight and a withdrawal program to break his morphine addiction. However, it was not just Göring that looked like a ghost of his former self. Rudolf Hess, the former deputy Führer, looked weak and frail. His mind had been deteriorating prior to his mad flight to broker peace with the Allies in 1941. This all took a major toll on his body. These men were now sitting like deer in headlights. At 10 AM, the International Military Tribunal Court convened, and an atmosphere of anger and suspense filled the air. At the same time, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence of Great Britain, who was the president of the trial, rapped his gavel to begin the trial. Shortly after he rapped his gavel to open the proceedings, souvenir hunters stole the gavel. Robert Jackson made it clear that the trial was not to persecute the whole of Germany, but just the men in the dock. Instead, the defense lawyers for the trial were trying to push that the trial was to force a sense of collective guilt onto the German people. As the trial went on, evidence shown during the trial did prove that at least some of the civilians had to have known what was going on. After all, did those civilians not wonder where the cattle cars that were filled with starving and crying people were going? On the 21st of November, just prior to lunchtime, the defendants would place a plea of not guilty, with Rudolf Hess only saying the word "Nein" when asked of his plea. Hermann Göring had written a speech to go along with his plea. However, Lawrence quickly shut Göring down. In the afternoon on that same day, Robert Jackson would start the trial with his opening address. During his monologue, Jackson would focus on the Nazis' aggressive war, for which he called the root cause of the other crimes. Jackson's opening address was well received by all those in the courtroom and those around the world. The first major piece of evidence that exposed the Nazi crimes was a film shown to the courtroom on the 29th of November 1945. The film was called Nazi Concentration Camps and was directed and filmed by Lieutenant Colonel George Stevens, who prior to the war worked in Hollywood as a director. During the film, the court saw the footage of bodies in the camps of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. A second film was also shown that showed members of the SS killing civilians in various abhorrent ways. The effect that these films had on the courtroom could not be missed. Judge Lawrence left the courtroom because of the films and he would not return for the rest of the day. The Nazi defendants' reactions to the films actually varied. A few of the defendants, such as von Ribbentrop, Hans Frank, and Wolfgang Funk, seemed to be in a state of minor shock, while Hermann Göring was irritated at the films and would write down, "They showed that awful film, and it just spoiled everything." Some of the other defendants actually looked bored and they did not care about the atrocities that they just witnessed. The next major piece of evidence that proved the barbarity of the Nazi crimes was when evidence was given from the Buchenwald concentration camp on the 13th of December 1945. Two of the more disturbing pieces of evidence that was given was the preserved tattooed skin of an inmate that was turned into a lampshade, and a preserved shrunken head of an inmate that was used as a paperweight. These grotesque items were owned by the wife of the commandant at the time of Buchenwald, Ilse Koch. By the 8th of December 1945, the prosecution had begun to introduce evidence to prove the criminality of 7 German organizations: the Nazi Party leadership, the SA, the SD, the SS, the German High Command, the Reich Cabinet, and the Gestapo. Starting in January, survivors from the concentration camps began to testify about the hell that they endured within the camps. The French journalist Marie-Claude Vaillant-Courtier provided eyewitness testimony of the atrocities at Auschwitz. Marie was part of the French resistance during the war. However, during early 1942 she was arrested and was sent to Auschwitz in 1943. In August of 1944, she was transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp and stayed there until the Red Army liberated the camp. On the days that court was in session, the defendants were allowed to eat together while on break. However, that was to end on the 16th of February 1946. The men were only allowed to eat from then on in groups of 4, excluding Göring, who was to eat alone. This decision was decided to limit Göring's influence on the other defendants, and because he would actually occasionally bully his co-defendants to drag out the trial. On the 18th of February 1946, the Soviet prosecutors showed a film called Documentary Evidence of the German Fascist Invaders. The footage in the film was captured German footage that showed the atrocities that the German invaders committed on the Eastern Front. The film also shows visual evidence of the extermination camps of Auschwitz and Majinsk. On March 6, 1946, once the Soviets finished their presentation, the prosecution would finally rest, and now it was time for the defense to begin their case on March 8, 1946. March 13th, 1946 was to see Hermann Göring take to the stand. In his ignorance, he had an answer for everything. He was outspoken, brash, likeable, and also humorous. He was difficult to question and waved around an answer to only give a general term to what was actually asked of him. Many in the court actually began to find him likeable. Goring admitted, however, that he was solely against going to war with England and thought that Operation Barbarossa came too premature, though he did believe Germany would face the USSR on the battlefield one day. Goring would show no remorse for what he was accused of and defended Hitler to the bitter end, and he also brashly admitted what he did in the plans for the Nazis' war of aggression. After Goring's testimony and cross-examination, a large portion of the other defendants would testify from mid-April of 1946 to the end of June 1946. On the 1st of April 1946, Rudolf Höss, the ex-commandant of Auschwitz concentration and death camp, not to be confused with the defendant Rudolf Hess, would provide an in-depth testimony as a witness for the defense of Gestapo and SD chief Ernst Kattelbrunner. In his affidavit, Höss would admit his role in the mass extermination of civilians in Auschwitz, as well as the use of Zyklon B gas that was used to murder the Jews and other civilians in the camp. A proportionate number of the defendants will claim that they did not know what was happening in these camps, while others would confess their crimes that they had committed. One of the defendants who admitted his role in the atrocities committed by the Nazis was Hans Frank, who was the Nazi governor of Poland. He would admit that he had a significant hand in committing atrocities against Polish civilians and Jews. On July the 4th, 1946, the defence summations would begin, and on July the 26th, 1946, the prosecution would begin their summation. The defence of the 7 Nazi organisations would begin on the 30th of July, 1946. These organisations would be later deemed as criminal organisations. Goring would return to the witness stand on the 20th of August. Again, he sat defiantly against the prosecution and genuinely just shrugged off any accusations of wrongdoing. 10 days later, all testimony would finish on the 30th of August, and on the 31st of August, the defendants would make their final statements. The first defendant to make their final statement was Hermann Goring, and in ignorant nature, he would not admit any fault even to the bitter end. Rudolf Hess would make his statement while sitting down due to his apparent poor health at the time. His statement would be cut short after he blabbered on for over 20 minutes. A majority of the defendants stayed defiant in their final statements, with most of them putting all the blame on their dear leader. Some of the defendants did admit guilt and were remorseful to a slight degree, but nearly all were staunch in their stance that all blame should be put on their Führer. The 2nd of September 1946 would see the justices meet to discuss a verdict for the defendants. The process to reach and deliver the verdicts would take until the 1st of October 1946. Of the 22 defendants who were on the stand, 11 were handed the death sentence. Hermann Goring was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to death by hanging. Rudolf Hess was guilty on counts 1 and 2 and was sentenced to life in prison. He would die in 1987. Karl Donitz was found guilty on counts 2 and 3 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He died in 1980. Hans Frank, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death. Wilhelm Frick, guilty on counts 2, 3 and 4, sentenced to death. Hans Fritzschen was acquitted. Wolver Funk, guilty on count 2, 3 and 4, sentenced to life in prison. Alfred Jodl, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death. Ernst Kattelbrunner, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death. Konstantin von Neurath, guilty on counts 1, 2, 3 and 4, sentenced to 15 years in prison, died in 1956. Franz von Papen, acquitted, died in 1969. Erich Raeder, guilty on counts 1, 2 and 3, sentenced to life in prison, released in 1955 due to ill health, died in 1960. Jochen von Ribbentrop, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death. Alfred Rosenberg, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death. Fritz Zackel, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to death. Dr. Hjalmar Schratt, acquitted, died in 1970. Baldur von Trier, guilty on count 4, sentenced to 20 years in prison, died in 1974. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, guilty on counts 2, 3 and 4, sentenced to death. Albert Speer, guilty on counts 3 and 4, sentenced to 20 years in prison. Julius Streicher, guilty on counts 4, sentenced to death. Those who were sentenced to serve their time in prison were sent to Spandau Prison, arriving there on the 18th of July 1947. 3 of the prisoners who were given life sentences would be released from Spandau, while only 1 lifer would die in Spandau Prison. Death sentences were to be carried out on the 16th of October 1946, after a short appeals process by the defendants. Needless to say, all appeals were revoked. Hermann Goering asked to be shot by firing squad rather than to be hung, as to him, being executed by firing squad was the soldier's way out. However, his request was denied. In a show of cowardice or defiance, he bit into a cyanide capsule and took his own life on the night before his scheduled execution. It is believed he obtained the capsule by way of one of the guards. Rudolf Hess would spend the rest of his life in Spandau prison, spending a majority of his time in a miserable state of mind behind bars. Hess would be the last prisoner in Spandau once Albert Speer was released. His appeals to be released kept being rejected as his mental state continued to decline. On the 17th of August 1987, he self-deleted himself at the age of 93. Spandau prison was demolished in August 1987 after Rudolf Hess died. Now on the very spot where 7 of the top Nazi officials once served time, a parking lot and a shopping mall stands to ensure no shrine to the Nazi regime may ever stand there. After the first trial at Nuremberg, there were an additional 12 trials that took place there. This would include the Einsatzgruppen trials and the doctors' trials. These men committed or acted as a vital cog within the fascist machine to create a world of hell that consumed the European continent for years. The Nuremberg trials were a way to try the perpetrators on the world stage and bring them to justice. Though their crimes may have been broadcast to the world in an effort to punish the perpetrators, but also to try and force other countries to not commit the same crimes, but ultimately this goal has failed to this very day. Thank you for watching. Please do like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell as well. If I did miss any important information, please do comment it down below for all to read and learn. Thank you and goodbye.